Hello, everybody, and welcome to this lecture on the principles of design balance. Balance is something that just keeps coming up over and over, no matter how hard you try to master it. It just seems like there's new ways to use it every time we look at it. So let's take a little closer look at balance so that we can better understand it. The first thing we really have to know about balance is if we're talking about a balanced image, we're talking about an equal distribution of visual information. Now, that doesn't mean that everything is exactly the same as you're going to see. Balance is achieved in a variety of ways and can mean a lot of different things. For instance, if you look at an image that's properly balanced, it can create a feeling of harmony and stillness, but it can also make it feel unsettling depending on how it's done. For more of that, watch a movie made by Stanley Kubrick and you will see his use of symmetry is often unsettling. But generally, balance in an image creates stasis and harmony. And so there's a few ways to do it, so let's take a look at that. The first thing we have to really understand before we go any further is that when we're talking about symmetry or balance at all, really, we're looking at pictorial balance, which means that there is a picture involved and there is a center axis that runs vertical. You can see that represented in the image by the vertical dotted line. Now, that's not a symmetrical image, obviously, as it's very different left to right. But what we always want to remember is we're not really talking about a horizontal dotted line. It can be done, but that's just not how we read. In the West, we read left to right. And even though we read words left to right, we actually read images left to right for the most part as well. If you're from another culture, that may be different. And so that this may have a little bit of a translation issue. If that's the case, I'd love to see how that translates into your own projects. So if we're talking about symmetrical balance, that's also known as formal balance. What we really mean is the distribution of visual information, both left and right of that dotted line. Typically, that shows up as a perfect mirror image or a near mirror image. It definitely creates a lot of unity, meaning that everything looks like it belongs in the image, and it makes the image extremely stable. Here's a great, well, sorry, there's no example yet. One more slide. All right. Another type of balance is horizontal balance. That's even distribution of visual weight on either side of the vertical axis. So that's kind of a different way of going about it. It's not very common, and even less common is vertical balance. That's the even distribution of visual weight on either side of a horizontal axis, meaning that that goes up and down. Like I was saying, we read left to right, so the horizontal symmetrical balance is more common than the vertical balance. Please don't trouble yourself with vertical balance for this course. Diagonal balance is probably even less common, although I do have an example of that here. And that's even distribution of visual weight across a diagonal axis, meaning that maybe from the top left to the bottom right, you're going to have the same information. This is something you might find in graphic design much more than you're going to find in fine art or in photography. Here's a great example of horizontal symmetrical balance. This is a wonderful painting by Ed Ruscha, Step on No Pets, which I believe is known as a palindrome. Correct me if I'm wrong there. But what you can see is basically a mirror reflection in the painted mountain. And yes, this is a painting. And the text only sort of reflects, right? And palindromes are spelled the same backwards as they are forwards. So if you look at no pets backwards, that says step on. And he did not reflect the text. And it's a little bit of a play, a little bit of variety, if you remember that term from the last unit. But what this really does is that makes us focus on the center of the image, but also really makes us ask the question, why is the mountain reflected and not the text? Vertical symmetrical balance, as I said, which is a little bit different here, you can see is demonstrated by Donald Judd, in which the axis of the piece goes vertical. Now, in this case, it's pretty straightforward. He's just repeating the same form over and over again along the vertical axis, and so it gives us that sense of vertical balance. But notice how this also feels like it could tip over, not just because the photograph is taken at an angle, but because we typically don't think of anything that's stacked vertically as being very balanced. If you don't believe me, stack a bunch of bricks as tall as your head and tell me how comfortable you feel about its balance. You probably won't feel very comfortable. Here's an example of diagonal symmetrical balance by Jeff Wall. You can see a very clear use of diagonal lines giving us a sense of distribution of weight along those lines. Now, this is not perfect symmetrical balance. It's very difficult to achieve. This is actually more of an asymmetrical balance, which we're going to talk about in a minute. But this does give us diagonal axes to work with. Now, asymmetrical balance or informal balance is the balance that's achieved with dissimilar objects on either side of whichever axis you're working with. The idea here is counterbalance. So the image is still balanced. It's not imbalanced. It tends to be a little bit more dynamic and create a lot more activity in the image. It also provides a lot more flexibility with what you're working with. For those of you interested in animation, you will find that asymmetrical balance is extremely common if you watch any kind of background paintings or if you look at anything with action in it. It'll still show some balance or stability to the image, but it's not doing it with the exact same imagery left to right. It also tends to work with more dynamic ranges of colors and values, which we're going to talk a little bit later in another unit. But it's going to work with darker colors and warmer colors and saturated colors moving far from center. So if you wouldn't want to put those heavier objects right in the middle, you're going to want to put them further out in the image. This is a little bit more complicated and is going to take a little bit more practice. You can see here is an example of asymmetrical balance. Now you might say that doesn't look like it's balanced at all, but I want you to consider what you're seeing. On the left side, you're seeing a very, very dark square, right? It's almost perfectly black. So that has a lot of visual weight, meaning that blacker values, which is what we refer to in dark and light, are heavier. They have more visual attention. The rectangle on the right is much larger by area, yet it's not as dark. So it's actually demanding less attention for a rectangle of its size than if it were darker. So the two of them together are occupying roughly the same visual weight. You can think of the old riddle, which weighs more, a ton of feathers or a ton of bricks? They both weigh exactly the same, a ton. However, it's going to take a lot more feathers to equal 1 ton than it will a brick. Here's another great piece by Haim Steinbach, who plays with balance in his work. You can see here that the use of black and red and alternating black and red creates another example of asymmetrical balance. It takes 3 of those bold 3 boxes with all of their intricate detail to equal the 2 very dark round pots. So it's kind of an intuitive formula. There's no math here involved. This is something that is debatable. And you will find that when you're using it in your images, you might, from time to time, have people disagree. But the stronger you get with this concept, the less people will tend to disagree with you. We can also use value, as I've been talking about, to create balance. So I feel like I've covered that pretty well, meaning that the darker values, the closer we get to black, the heavier it is. So it's going to require less information. The lighter the value, the closer we get to white, it's going to require more information to equal the same amount of a smaller amount of black. I hope that makes sense. We'll be able to play with it later. We can also balance things by shape. You can see here that there are 2 shapes, a rectangle and a squiggly little Rorschach blot. The Rorschach blot looking thing is much more intricate, has a lot more articulation, therefore is demanding a lot more of our attention than the rectangle. They're both using the exact same fill texture, but one is definitely more articulated. So sometimes you can think of visual weight by how much attention it demands of you. Texture, again, as I just talked about, as one of the elements of design, which we haven't talked about. But you can see the very fine texture on the left next to the very coarse texture on the right. The coarse texture using a higher contrast range of black and white versus the finer texture using grays balance each other out. Notice how much more prominent the texture on the right feels. To me, it almost feels like it's imbalanced, like that the entire left half of the image needs to be gray in order to counteract the weight of the one on the right. Another type of balance that you might use if you get involved in graphic design or if you work with mandalas is radial balance. This is a composition that everything is distributed from a center point, like a clock or a pinwheel. What this really does is this creates an immediate and undeniable sense of unity. Everything in that image belongs together very clearly. And it points directly to the center. There's no doubt where the focal point of the image is. A great example of that are mandalas. Now, from a design point of view, these are also really great because they allow us to repeat these, but we're not going to play with pattern just yet. We'll be doing that later in the semester. What I really want you to notice is how much it looks like a million little arrows pointing right to the center of those designs. Now, this can be for a lot of reasons. This can be for metaphoric reasons, if you're wanting to build your designs that way, but it can also be for very practical reasons. For instance, if I want to do something that is eventually going to incorporate text, and I want the text to be at the forefront, using a radial balance pattern like this makes it easier for me to place my text in the center of the image and have it be easy to find. Now, crystallographic balance, that's a mouthful, I know, also known as all-over balance, is a unique type of balance. This is one that does not use any type of axis at all. This is where you have something that is repeated over an entire two-dimensional surface. This is also known as a pattern, but as you're going to see, it has to repeat pretty much exactly for it to create the type of balance that we're talking about here. Now, there are no focal points to this. There's no beginning or end, and it's often non-representational or non-objective. Now, what we mean by that is that it uses language similar to the mandalas here. You might interpret those as flowers, but there's actually not a specific objective flower in there. They're just abstract shapes that loosely form to make something feel like a flower. So that's what we mean by non-objective or non-representational. Here you can see a really great example of this in one of Andy Warhol's famous Campbell Soup silkscreens. Here, instead of the iconic one can, he's using multiple cans, much like you would see at the grocery store. The idea here is that no one can is distinguishable from the other, and they just kind of continue ad infinitum. It speaks very clearly to the consumeristic avarice that he was admiring to a certain extent, but it also makes for a very intense kind of feel if you look at this. While we don't really focus on any can, we're sort of overwhelmed by the amount of information that's coming at us. This is also true with text. Now, this is a text piece by Mel Bochner. And in this case, he is just using synonyms for money over and over and over again, all in different colors, but all of them using the exact same font and size. There's no variation in capitalization, and the only punctuation present is the comma, and then, of course, the little dollar signs at the end. And here we don't really focus on any one word typically, although you might say that the word penny right in the middle kind of jumps out because it has different levels of color saturation, which we'll speak about in just a couple of weeks. Here, though, you get kind of lost in the repetitive balance that's going on. The whole thing is engaging you equally, which makes it very difficult to see this for what it is. Now, imbalance is the exact opposite of balance, and a lot of times students get this confused with asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance is still balanced, right? Imbalance means that there is no balance to the image. There is a lack of equal visual weight being distributed across your axes. There is no sense of equilibrium. It oftentimes feels very unsettled. It feels unfinished, and it can feel also like it's trying to have the viewer add something that's not present. If you have this in a design, it is really critical that it is there intentionally. If it's not there intentionally, it is going to be very difficult for you to really explain in any kind of conceptual design logic. What I really want you to pay attention to is this plate right here, which is probably the most explicit plate I could find. Here you see no attempt at counterbalancing. We have one big giant black U shape, and then there's a tiny one on the right-hand side. There's nothing happening on the right-hand side of the image that is compensating for what's happening on the left. It is overwhelmingly heavy to the left and overwhelmingly lighter to the right. This is very much imbalanced. Now, from a design point of view, you may do this because you want to place text in those open areas on the right. You may want to do it to create a sense of breaking up. This looks almost like it's the remnants of a larger object that is breaking up. So there are reasons to use this, but you always want to be very deliberate about why you're using something like imbalance. Okay, so now you feel like you know what you're doing, right? We have a few different types of balance to study. Let's take a look at some images and see what we got. What kind of balance do you think this is? If you guess symmetrical balance, you're correct. Now, it's not perfectly symmetrical, meaning that there are some slight variations left to right, but when you squint your eyes at it, it pretty much looks exactly the same left to right. What kind of balance is this? If you said asymmetrical balance, I would accept that. I've had this debate many times with students whether or not this is imbalanced or asymmetrically balanced. But I think when you look at the size of the hot pink pants on the left and how simple that image is, compared to the smaller image on the right, but much more complex, it seems very similar to the concept of balance by shape. Right? There's a lot more articulation on the right than the left, but the left is much larger. So you can argue that it is counterbalanced. I think the clue is that if you look at the text on the bottom left, it's sort of reflected across a diagonal axis to the top right. So that kind of tells us that this is supposed to feel like a balanced image. Another clue is that this is actually an album cover for Beck's Midnight Vultures. Typically anything that's done for commercial purposes should feel balanced in some way, because if it feels imbalanced, people may not want to buy it. Apologies. What kind of balance is this? This, if we ignore the explicit content advisory label, which you always should ignore that, this is definitely imbalanced, right? Look at the clear focus on the face on the left. His legs and his feet kind of drift off into nothingness on the right. So we're seeing something that's very clearly intended to grab our focus. Now, if you're wondering why would they use this on a real album cover, well, it's supposed to be pretty unsettling. I'm sure many of you, the second you saw this image, were pretty unsettled.